Welcome to Wild Heart Revival, a gathering place for heartfelt conversations and stories as pathways of renewal and revival. I am your host, Te Tayari, and it is a real pleasure to have you here for the very first episode of this brand new project. Today's guest is Báyò Akómoláfé, who is someone that I have been looking up to for many years. I've been following him from a distance online, reading many of his essays, listening to interviews with him, and continuously being impressed by the impeccable and consistent invitation to stretch my mind and my heart in ways that are creative, beautiful, and inspiring. And so naturally, it was a true honor to have him on as my first guest of this project, and I very much look forward to sharing this conversation with you. Báyò Akómoláfé, rooted with the Yoruba people in a more than human world, is the father to Alethea and Kaya, the grateful life partner to EJ, son and brother. A widely celebrated international speaker, post-humanist thinker, poet, teacher, public intellectual, essayist, and author of 2 books, These Wilds Beyond Our Fences, Letters to My Daughter on Humanity's Search for Home, and We Will Tell Our Own Story, The Lions of Africa Speak. Báyò Akómoláfé is the founder of the Emergence Network, a planet-wide initiative that seeks to convene communities in new ways in response to the critical civilizational challenges we face as a species. He is host of the post-activist course, festival, event, We Will Dance with Mountains. He currently lectures at Pacifica Graduate Institute, California. He sits on the board of many organizations, including Science and Non-Duality in the United States and Ancient Futures in Australia. So as you can see, his resume is extensive, and I'm sure that didn't encapsulate all of it. If you are curious about my other offerings, including the counsel work that I do with individuals and couples, as well as recent essays that I've written, and to keep up to date with new podcast episodes, you can visit coyotecouncil.earth. You can find the link to that in the show notes. And at my website, you can join the mailing list, where you will receive a monthly email that updates you on all the recent offerings and creative works that I have put out. Once again, thank you for being here. And with all of that in mind, let's get into the conversation. I have some notes here, so that's where I'm going to start. I was reading your essay in preparation for this conversation, and
which one?
The one When the World Becomes Solid. Yeah. And I love that in that essay you were calling for a politics of tenderness.
Yes.
And so I think that this is a really wonderful place to start our conversation. And I would love if you could explore in this moment how you define tenderness. In this context, of course, in the essay, but maybe just in general, especially since right now is a tender moment in your personal life. And what distinguishes it from capitulation or the imposition of a particular worldview? And then furthermore, how might tenderness contribute to the emergence of something beautiful amid inevitable challenges, difficulties, and even heartbreak?
Okay. Thank you, brother. First of all, just to say my heartfelt congratulations on this first of many steps that you take in a journey that is called by these turbulent moments for conversations that you will be hosting. And I'm so honored to be first among these many to come. I recently had a well, not quite recently. I had a rich conversation, I think a couple of years ago, maybe 2 years now, about the about trauma as a freezing of bodies. It's like an incarceration of bodies within space-time coordinates. It's like it freezes not just bodies, but it freezes time. It freezes us in space. And there's something colonial about some iterations of embodiment. And what I mean to say here is that I think about the world through process. I don't think about the world as a static container of pre-relational entities, things that have features or essences, right? And idealized forms. I think of the world as this teenage, awkward, inquiry, open-ended experiment. There's a tentativeness about the world that resists the Cartesian premises that have governed modern civilization for a long time. So the world isn't made up of things, the world is relational. It's not that the world is in relationship, it's that the world is practice, the world is relational, right? So that the appearance of solidity does not, or should not, within this kind of framework, obscure the ways that the solidity is also an entanglement of practices. The table, knock on wood, is an entanglement of practices. Its solidity is contingent upon flow, or it is flow in a particular kind of way. I think as in times of traumatic upheavals, such as what we're experiencing now in the Middle East, in the Anthropocene, and with racial justice and injustice, with the radioactive human becoming a little bit more toxic than usual. And I don't mean toxic in a popular sense. I mean it in the radioactive sense of actually refusing to generate and produce. We're in such times that this solidity is becoming culturally perceivable. And we're noticing it, I would theorize that we're noticing this solidity in terms of the increasing tribalism in politics, the inability for nuanced conversation, the lack of capacity to hold tension and complexity, right? So we are skewing, or no, that's not the word. We are homing in on the on binaries, right? You're either in or out, right? This is why cancellation is possible, because we are in like some kind of late stage violence of modern civilization, where everything is either this or that. When I speak about a politics of tenderness, some have misconstrued that as just being kind, being nice. In fact, to my chagrin, recently, a number of, it seems, multi-faith leaders and rabbis used my words to suggest exactly that. It seemed at least one particular reading would lean in that direction. It's like many people would say that I'm saying, oh, let's just be kind to one another. I don't mean that. I mean that when colonial forms become impervious to flow, when they become so solid, when identity becomes so impervious, right? Even minoritarian identity, when it becomes so static and impervious to flows, to the generosity of the so-called outside, when it loses its ability to traffic between chaos and itself, then we have what we're experiencing today. A politics of tenderness would be inquiry at the edges of identity. Right? It would be inquiry at the edges of my skin. It would be tending to the liminality of my body. It would be interrogating the form and the crisis of form that has propagated and rendered abundant the violence of this time, the violence of framing home as a nation state, the violence of framing identity as essential and necessary. Yes, a politics of tenderness would be, to me, the fugitive other creeping into the thick lines we've drawn in the sand to divide you and I from each other. Yes.
Yeah. It makes me think of another concept that I've seen you write about, this idea of radical accompaniment. And I'm wondering if you could delve deeper into what that really means to you. Maybe how it's connected to this idea of a politics of tenderness, not just in the collective, but with the self too.
Yeah.
But also maybe in the context of what you call societal monsters, and how this idea of radical accompaniment might be contributing to the formation of what you also have seen termed stranger solidarities.
Yes. Yes.
Could you explore those concepts together in this moment for us?
Yeah. Well, in terms of the first one was the first one you wanted me to talk about?
Radical accompaniment.
Radical accompaniment.
Yeah.
The radical accompaniment. Well, perhaps the greatest story, and I'm exploring this story in a series of books about the Yoruba trickster god whose name is Eshu. One of the greatest stories that I've ever heard is about this trickster who stopped his brother gods, an Orisha, and a fellow god's attempt to stop the slave trade. And it's, instead of stopping it and ensuring victory for the black bodies that were about to be taken across the Atlantic, he stole into the slave ship. He crept into the slave ship and accompanied them across the waters. And I love that story.
Wow,
I didn't.
it's a different story, isn't it?
It is. I tell it all the time.
I love that.
It's a different story because it speaks about this. First of all, it marks the inability of coloniality to be fully effective. Right? That even within the body of the slave ship, there is an errancy or an errantry, right? There is something that disturbs and muddies the measurements that have taken place to demarcate bodies and to designate others as other and me as me, right? That something turns, a worm of some kind, a cosmic worm churns and curdles the milk and disrupts power as powerful, right? It's para-ontological. It's beneath the surface of things. So that when the captain of the ship holds up his numbers and says, yep, we have 77 bodies on board. We can leave now. There was always the 78th. There was the 78th body on board. And it was that archetypal force, that more than human quality that creolized the world, that upended the systems of mastery that presumes that to flatten the world is to gain control, right? That something glitchy was in that calculation. But the act of radical accompaniment seems to me to prefigure some kind of a politics, an emancipatory post-humanist politics that feels possible today. Why is that important to say? I think we are at the edges of the human. And the human is not the anthropomorphic shapes that we've assumed. The human individual is not the body that presents with an ID or a name. That's just the tail end of it. The human individual is a cartography. It's a cartographic project. It's an ethnography. It's a way of moving in the world. And it's not the individual that moves. It's the world that moves that makes the individual possible. Cities have to be built to make the individual possible. Highways and pathways and signs and symbols and languages and materials and names and IDs and colors and textures and furniture need to come together in order for the individual to be possible, right? So the individual is not a thing that moves in the world. It's the world in how it moves, right? And that territory then, given what I've said, it's possible to see the human as a territory, as a flattening, as a colonial series of relations, as a dense forest of practices. In that territory, it seems we have run out of its creativity. That territory of the human has produced men on Mars. It has, or rather, on the moon. Well, Mars is coming soon, right? So it's not that much of a stretch.
Robots, at least, yeah.
It's produced AI and toilets and Elon Musk and Twitter. And none of these are good or bad. They're cultural, they're forms of creativity. But the creativity of a morality or of a moral structure is limited. And we are noticing the limitations of the human with regards to critical events like what we rudely call the Anthropocene, right? It's literally named after that moral structure. The crisis of that moral structure is that we've become such a dominant species, according to this narrative, that we can see our death, right? It's our death is a certainty. If we continue on this path, then that seems to be the case. It's not just that if we continue, it seems we don't know how to stop, despite we're doing all of this in spite of ourselves. So the human is this territory that is straining and pushing and heaving and holding and inquiring and experimenting, and is exhausted, right? So at this time, I feel an animist kind of ethics is needed. A way of reframing bodies as relational capacities of the planet, a different kind of cartography that might take us on different kinds of feedback loops with the planet, a different kind of experimentation and politics that does not begin with the individual that acts, but that notices that the world acts and individuals are secreted from such actions. Does that make sense? That it seems we're in such a time when it is increasingly difficult to begin from the human individual in the popular sense of it, that we are relations. We don't live on the planet. We are the planet, right? And that would take different kinds of journeys, brother, different kinds of expeditions, or rather dispersals, not expeditions. Expeditions sound warlike. I think it would take different kinds of fungal dispersals to experiment with these times, to meet the world differently. And in my theorizations about this, radical accompaniment is how we do this. We have to follow new patterns, artistic politics, We have to go to the places that have been pathologized. And there we can mount up sensuous solidarities. And what that means, I could talk about later on.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. There's so much in that. It get me when you brought up this this sense of needing to really transition into an animist worldview, essentially, like to expand our horizons into the more than human, to recognize ourselves as a living dynamic process embedded within and a part of the earth. I started to think about how you talk about the trickster often, and you mentioned
Yeah.
that brief story about the radical accompaniment across the seas with the
Yes.
slave ships. I'm curious, like, how might the role of tricksters be involved in awakening this real sense of this experience of animism, and what role does the trickster play aside from that in the time of this civilizational decline that we're so obviously a part of and being called to hold, and particularly in like coaxing us away from safe grounds towards the ambiguous and the unsettling realms
Mhm.
of existence.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think you can already start to feel that, brother, in the forget me if I'm wrong. I follow popular culture, especially popular culture emanating from from the United States, because it's such a rich archive, a dynamic archive of things to talk about and to explore.
Mhm.
Um, uh, at some point, it seemed as if comedians were in trouble. And there were lots of conversations about cancellation and
Yeah.
comedians and stand-up comedy and the slap that was heard around the world. You know, all those dynamics. It's like, where is the space of the comedian? And I started to write a piece. I haven't completed it yet. Other pieces have come and gone in between that time. But I started to write a piece with a dear Kenyan sister of mine around um, comedy and cancellation.
Mm.
And and the heart of this essay is to ask what happens when we become incredibly serious. Um, when we when we
Mhm.
when ambiguity is exiled completely, right? There's no ambiguity, there's no uncertainty. The definitions are right to the molecule, right? We have um, atomic structures built from the ground up to safeguard ourselves. We have ways of pronouncing ourselves, and we have punitive measures um, that we agree is appropriate when we are mispronounced. So there are no mispronunciations. There's no ambiguity. That's very serious. We're precise.
Yeah.
That when precision becomes the zeitgeist, and the comedian is exiled and becomes pathological, that something happens to culture. It's rendered incapable of noticing its own self, right?
Mm.
Of noticing its indebtedness to movement. It's rendered incapable of actually grieving and being present with its own generosities, right?
Right.
It's the you know you can almost think about it in form of geometric lines. If the lines do not stray away from their geometric precision, then there's nothing outside of it. There's no wealth there. There's no real appreciation there. There's
Mm.
only there's only the theoretical utopian commitment to uh, the production of particular forms of being alive. So yeah, it,
Yeah.
I
Mm.
if you get what I'm saying, it seems that um, that we're in such times that that's becoming true, more and more true. We're losing that ambiguity. And so the question now for me is, especially with regards to what you're asking, the trickster, the trickster is the invitation for us to not be so serious, right?
Yeah.
The trickster is the archetypal porosity that helps us stand beside ourselves, right? The trickster shows up in different forms, not just in storytelling, but even in entheogenic psychedelic practices. The trickster is that which says, you know, you're not entirely the subject you think you are, or you're not the object you think you are. The world is too promiscuous in its entrainment to fully fit within your structure.
Mm-hmm.
So leave space for rust, leave space for decay and entropy, right? Leave space for falling. And that's what the trickster offers. The trickster is the monster, you know, the monster at the edge. And it's only with monstrous interventions that emancipation, especially from radioactive cycles of convergence, it's only with monstrous intervention, a transversal cut in the assemblage, that something new, a different difference might emerge. And that's where, for me, politics thrives, in that the break, the crack that a trickster makes possible.
Yeah. Yeah, in my own, I do counsel work with people, and the name of my counsel is Coyote Counsel. And so I work with the energy of Coyote, and so the trickster really guides my practice and my understanding of myself. It's this continual dynamic relationship that I'm cultivating because of many of the things you just shared. And one of the things that I am really grappling with or dancing with lately is this understanding that coyote is this like beckoning of the wild. Like the coyote is just beyond the pale of civilization, howling into the night, beckoning us to leave the familiarities behind, so that we are called into a greater understanding of our creative capacities, of our transformative possibilities. And so I'm feeling really inspired by the trickster and coyote in my own life, and how, if we can develop a deeper relationship with that archetypal energy within, and even connect with a creature of some kind that really embodies that, like the coyote, that we can begin to awaken the wildness of our being, that untamed creative force within, the origin from which all things, creative things, flow in and through and out from us. And so, in light of transformative possibilities, something that I'm up against in my private counsel practice with people, particularly young men, is that they've never been properly initiated into manhood. They've just always been a part of modernity, civilization, but they've never been taken outside of it in some kind of significant way and stripped bare and destroyed, so that they can remake themselves anew, specifically in the context of community and older men. I know in my own life, I've never really had older men in my life growing up. And so I'm seeing this now with these young men in my practice. And so I'm curious about your thoughts on this pervasive lack of initiatory structure for men, particularly in modernity, and what kinds of maybe personal experiences that you may have to share on the topic. Like, for example, if it feels okay for you to share, like, when did you know you became a man? Or how might you know that your son will be a man? You know, does that feel okay to
Oh, that is a beautiful, no, it's a beautiful question, brother. And thank you for asking. I actually just experienced the sadness of also knowing that I was I wasn't part of initiatory performances that that the only mark or signal or signpost that I had become a man was a passing of my father, right? It was a passing of my own father, and the recurrent whispers and sometimes stentorian remarks that I had to become a man, right? That I was being the only son of the house and the one bearing the family name. I had to do more, I had to support my family, my widowed mother and my sisters. And so I learned how to become a man in the hustle. Right? And my hustle was carrying chairs for rental, across local governments, sometimes on my back, sometimes pushing them across the neighborhood and cooking chicken on the streets so that I could feed and raise money to take care of the house, my home. And it's there in the vortices of loss and pain and ambiguity and scholarship, because my scholarship did take off even before I became an undergrad. All this happened before I even went to the university. Was reading theological texts from 2 centuries before, and downloading them on my floppy disk from the newly created, newly furnished internet cafes that were springing up around our street corners, and then printing 1,000 pages and reading it while I made chicken on the road. Right.
Wow.
So this is how I became a man in this way. And there's something saddening about that, because the city's work is its greatest, if you will, or among its greatest treasures is the anonymity that it promises the new individual, right? It says, release yourself from your indebtedness to ecology, to others, make something of yourself. And once you kind of once you're dissociated that way, then a rite of passage isn't really required. It's not required. The hyper individualism of nation states like the US, it speaks to that. You're alone. You're alone, and when you're alone, a rite of passage isn't needed. So, a little bit of that, the echoes of that quest for purity has spilled into the promises of development and the global nation state order seeking growth and progress. And so I was caught up in those eddies, those flows too. And I didn't find, I couldn't know I was a man until I don't even know if I still am, if you will, right? Because not that a rite of passage is a brand of certainty, right? But what hurling yourself from several feet in the sky, in some Polynesian cultures, hurling, I think Vanuatu, hurling yourself, so the precursor to bungee jumping, from the sky and coming this close, to shattering your brain on the earth. What that brings you to, as you said, being stripped down, is our indebtedness to liminality, right? That you haven't really begun to live until you've come this close to death, right? You're only living when you take a life. So a boy in Kenya goes to kill a lion and he brings it back not to eat of himself, but to eat with others. And they applaud him, right? So those practices seem to have been, archetypal forms that traveled across the planet that reminded us that, to hold close death, to hold close the trickster, right? And to travel with these resources. But the city does not compel us to travel in that way. It compels us to settle, to be known, to be seen, to be represented. And that does away with a rite of passage. Maybe we need rites of passage now. Maybe the transatlantic slave trade, as Brother Orland Bishop would say, was a rite of passage. Maybe we need to be taken away now. Maybe some kind of embarkation is already happening. Maybe a massive disabling event is already afoot. And maybe it doesn't look like killing a lion or something, but maybe it looks like a politics of tenderness, like the cutting away of our flesh, of certainty, of stability. And maybe with that cutting away, we are being initiated maybe into something utterly unspeakable, at least from this vantage point.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing all of that. It makes me think of, I've been thinking a lot about death lately. I was trained as a death doula, and I've read so many books about death from different teachers and different perspectives on what it means to be with dying, what it means to live with the steady companionship of death. Like Don Juan says, keep death on your left shoulder as an advisor to everything that you do. And I find that really important and actually very enlivening. And when I think about this idea of wildness and what I was mentioning before, going beyond the pale of civilization in order to really to be reflected back to yourself for the truth of who you are. Like I sense that you can't even really know the truth of who you are unless you find yourself in some wild spaces for some significant amount of time, because you don't really begin to realize how much of a flowing mash of energies and interrelated beingness that you are until you really get into a wild space and you can see death and decay, and you can see how all the creatures and the plants and the winds and the waters are consistently dancing together and co-arising. But so when I think about people trapped in cities, and they may not think that they're trapped, but I really do see that, like cities as entrapment in many ways. Cities kind of hide away death, like you don't see, if a tree starts to die in the city, they come and cut it down. And then of course on the human level, we hide our old folks away. In the West, at least, we hide them away in homes. People are dying and they're in the hospitals. When they die, they get put in a bag and ushered out. And right, there's this hidden dimension to death. And it makes me wonder, like, if we really there needs to be a revival of this intimacy with, of course, our own death, but with being with dying. And especially in this time now where the earth in many ways is dying, organs of it per se are dying. It's really important to really meet the truth of that so that we can be with what's happening, so that we can then respond in some kind of meaningful way. When I'm in Nicaragua now. I drove all the way here from Canada over the past year and a half. Yeah, it's been a long journey. And something that people say is, oh, you're so lucky, you're so blessed that you drove to Nicaragua from Canada. It must have been beautiful. And I say, yes, and it's been incredibly painful. Because something you realize when you drive across North America and Central America is how much pain there is in the land, how much drought there is, how many of the forests have been clear cut. I just drove through El Salvador. 98% of the country has been clear cut. It's just like dust and heat, so much of of the Western California and the Southwest of the United States is desert. Most of Mexico is desert, and it's just expanding and expanding, and so it's painful, you know. It's so immediate, and that's so obvious to me. And so I guess I know that this is very relevant for you today, and I don't know how much you want to get into it, but it kind of seems to have naturally arisen in our conversation. Right. I wonder how much you are consciously attending to maybe your own death, but even just the understanding that death is a trusted and important advisor, and what are some of the reflections that arise for you when you gaze out into the world and see the rampant denial of death in the West, at least?
Well, today I spent some time looking at the body of a relative.
Yeah.
She was unrecognizable, and she was in a glass casing. And this was no longer surprising to me. This part that I'm about to talk about, the part, you know, the fact that she was in the home, right? When there's a passing in India, there isn't a scurrying away of the bodies. They bring the body back into the home, and people gather around and sing. You know, this is not a funeral home. They bring the body into the house it left.
Right.
And, you know, it was in India that I came that close to a dead body. It was here in India that began to happen for me. The shock of that is no longer as prominent as it was. But today I spent time standing and just being with that auntie that passed away this morning. And of course, you know, images of passing and death, mine inclusive, have always lived with me, you know. At some point, it was a Christocentric framework that helped me organize my inquiries around death. Where do we go? Who gets to go there? What is your guarantee of arriving there? What forms would we assume when we're there? It's a very Christocentric theology. These days, I tend to think about black holes and Saturn rings and the jazz music that is swimming through the air that are, you know, orifices cannot pick up. I'm specifically thinking about NASA's news some time ago, I think last year, that it had heard the sound of Sagittarius A, which is the biggest black hole in the Milky Way. And this huge monster had been awakened by cosmic dust. It's like this dust traveled across its nostrils and it stirred it to life. It had been dormant for some time and it sneezed. It's just like this monster sneezed, and its music has been traveling through space-time for 200 years now, since it was awakened. At a time when white modernity and industrialization was, you know, asserting its presence, at a time when Charles Dickens, you know, on the 9th of June, I think in the 1800s, experienced a train crash that led to the first theorizations about trauma, at least modern trauma. At a time when genocide was being committed in the countries of Africa and across the world, there was this music playing. There was this sound playing, this eerie alien sound, like angelic children at play, right? And running around a tree or something. Those are the images I get. And somehow, I don't know, this sound of a black hole, this music of the starry skies, suggests to me that death needs a new cosmology, that the death of modernity, the death that is the villain to be slayed, to be killed by the returning Messiah, that death is a creature of the city. And by the city, I mean white modernity writ large. I'm thinking about the city as a metaphor, a placeholder here, that the death of the city looks like the city. It's a terminus. It's a scurrying out of the text of experience. I tend to think about, black holes and the soul between, and where the soul is not a ghost living with inside the flesh, but the continued vitality and vibrancy of decay, and that consciousness does not even need a self, to be itself. That's what I think about. It fills me with wonder, but it also fills me with dread. It's like a poetic tragedy of some kind. Yeah, that's what I'll say about that.
Yeah. Filled with wonder and dread at the same time.
Yeah.
More and more as I'm aging, I'm still quite young, but just as the years go by, and I feel like I'm maybe unraveling a little bit more truth throughout my days of how I know myself in the world. People will ask me just what people do. How are you? Right? And I have this consistent feeling that I could, like, in any moment, sure, in any moment, one feeling or emotion or something is maybe emphasized, but I do have this sense that I could cry, I could scream, I could smile, I could laugh, I could jump up and down, I could lay down in depression. Like I have this sense that it's all here with me right now, and that I could answer that question in any which way, and that it actually, and then that kind of gives me a sense of creative capability in that moment to just kind of answer whatever is creative in that moment. But you remind me of that when you say that you're filled with wonder and dread through that reflection, because I'm just noticing that there's this balancing quality, like the more that I can touch the truth of my being or the ground of my being, that I can feel so many of these opposing qualities of self, but actually that they're not in opposition to each other, that the dread and the wonderment they're a team,
Yes. I mean, I have this secondary not primary in the sense of actually experiencing those entities. I'm speaking about masquerades, these African spirits that dance through villages. I never got to experience that except through stories that were told on television about these traditions in demise. And so I had this secondary reaction to them. It was both of wonder, right? Because the way the masquerade passes in its wildness, in its untenable forms, in its promiscuity, in its serious ambiguity, or its ambiguous seriousness, is that it said that if you're outside when it's passing, at least one of the traditions held it in this way, that if you're outside when it's passing, you'll be whipped, you'll be beaten. There was this long whip and you'll be beaten. So when the masquerade is passing, you better hide. It's not Santa Claus. It's not you better not hide. It's you better you better be hiding when it's coming. So I mean, my sisters and I will feel this desire to hide when we're hearing the stories, but we also want to peep you can only see it from squinted eyes, slanted eyes. So it was both of dread and wonder, and between that, it was all play, right? And it reminded me of a playful universe that is still coming into being, a playful world that has not fully interrogated itself or its physical laws or its spiritual laws. Play, right?
Yeah.
And that is my politics.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I know you only have a few minutes, and that just opened up a whole world for me. I read this book recently. It's called it's called Free Play: Improvisation for Art and Life. Forgetting the author's name. Great
Okay.
book, really great. But he's exploring this idea of lila, this Sanskrit term that means it's like the cosmic divine play of things.
Hmm.
How creation is inherently playful, that it's just
Hmm.
trying things out, it's
Hmm.
improvising on the spot. And
Hmm.
kind of the thesis of the book is like that's what life is.
What is the name of this book again?
Free play.
Free Play. I'll check it out.
Yeah,
And the
it's
concept of Leela, you say?
yeah,
Leela?
lila,
Okay.
divine play. It's a Sanskrit term. And
Okay.
so and kind of a lot of what we were talking about today is like, how do we begin to find what you call like the cracks and the openings in the perceivable solidness of our orientation to life? How can we begin to find the flow rather than the rigidity? And that's really what he's exploring in that book, and that's what I'm really wanting to explore with this project. And I'm the working title of this project, of course, this is the first conversation, it's not released yet, but I'm calling it, I think, Wild Heart Revival. It's like the only thing that really made sense for me and where I'm at right now. And to me, it's that it carries the essence of the coyote, the trickster, that beckoning into the wildness of our being, but it also carries that essence of which the trickster embodies so beautifully, of improvisation, of being a creative participant in the dance and the lila and the play of life. And so my question to you, final question here at the end, is what does it mean? What does wild heart revival mean to you? What does it mean to have a wild heart?
Hmm. Well, I permit me just to share this
Yeah.
this shockingly beautiful vision of what um, Jewish texts would call the Tahom, I think. And it's this primeval, monstrous, primordial entity of some kind, like a whirlpool of dust and teeth and possibility.
Yeah.
Um, and it's from this chaos that maybe the French philosopher Deleuze might associate with immanence, difference, something that cannot be represented or named, and but yet is the source and condition of all kinds of naming and identities and differences. This tehom, this lila, if you will, this playfulness, this Milky Way or milky field is the wildness of things.
Mm.
I don't think of a wild heart as an original image to return to,
Mm.
uh, or an original set of rituals to just copy and paste within our time.
Yeah.
I don't think of it as a matter of even pathologizing modernity and saying, "Oh, something went wrong and we have to go back." That's a modern reading, ironically. You
Mm.
know, to go back to
Yeah.
something else that has been lost seems to be vexingly close to particular forms of modernity that are implicated in the kinds of troubles we're trying to interrogate. So the wildness of hearts, or the wild heart, it seems to be a reference to a Dionysian, playful, Lilithian, animist, post-humanist longing for the more than human. Right. A place of play without answers, a place of questions without the prospects of arriving at some utopian truth, a place of holding each other while we go down together, a spirituality of descent, of descending, a placing of red ochre, um, you know, painted hands on cave walls as the sky tears itself in solar flares. It's a place of repair, where repair is not to return to an image that has been lost, but to seek new wild alliances with others, to repair, to pair again with other alliances, the sensuous crustacean complicities and alliances and complexities that make us alive, and alive in ways we do not even know how to speak to yet.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this, Bayo. Yeah, I really appreciate it, brother.
Thank you, brother. Thank you so much.